The hospital lobby buzzed with routine until a weathered man in a corduroy jacket whispered a name that made the nurses freeze. Arthur Hemlock. In a place built to heal, he'd been forgotten until someone who remembered walked back through the door. Welcome to Stallone Stories. Let's uncover what really happened. The automatic doors hissed open, a sigh of conditioned air greeting Silas as he stepped into the main lobby of City General. It wasn't a place he frequented, not by choice. Hospitals, in his experience, were repositories of hushed anxieties and the sharp, sterile scent of battles fought in quiet rooms. He paused for a moment, a tall, unassuming figure in a worn corduroy jacket, his presence easily overlooked amidst the morning rush of staff, visitors, and the low thrum of institutional life. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the organized chaos. The information desk with its perpetually besieged attendant, the numbered corridors branching off into unseen depths, the muted palette of pale greens and beiges meant to soothe, but which often felt more like a surrender. He carried a small, canvas satchel slung across his chest, its straps softened with age. Inside, nestled among a few papers, was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, its surface smooth from years of unconscious touch. He approached the main reception, a long counter behind which two nurses in crisp blue uniforms were fielding calls and queries with practiced efficiency. One, with a name badge reading Martha, RN, head nurse, looked up, her expression professionally neutral, but with an undercurrent of weariness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clear but devoid of warmth. Silas met her gaze. "I'm here to see Arthur Hemlock," he said, his own voice low, steady. The name hung in the air for a beat. Martha's fingers paused on her keyboard. The other nurse, younger, with CHLOE, RN on her badge, who had been sorting a stack of patient files, visibly stiffened. Her head turned slightly, her eyes flicking from Silas to Martha, then quickly away. It was a subtle reaction, almost imperceptible, but Silas, a man attuned to the nuances of silence and subtle shifts in demeanor, noted it. Martha's brow furrowed slightly. "Arthur Hemlock," she repeated, as if dredging the name from a distant, cluttered archive. She tapped a few keys, her gaze fixed on the monitor. "Ward 7. East Wing. Are you family?" Silas considered the question. Family was a word with many layers. "A friend," he said. "A very old friend." Martha gave a curt nod. "Visiting hours for Ward 7 start at 10. You can wait in the main lounge." She gestured vaguely toward a collection of molded plastic chairs. "He's not expecting visitors as far as our records show." The implication was clear. Don't cause any trouble. Chloe, the younger nurse, still hadn't met his eyes again. She was suddenly very engrossed in arranging a display of public health pamphlets. Silas absorbed this, the slight chill in the air that had nothing to do with the hospital's ventilation. Arthur, it seemed, was not a priority, perhaps even an inconvenience. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." He didn't move towards the lounge immediately. Instead, he let his gaze drift across the lobby, taking in the details: the wilting plant in the corner, the scuff marks on the linoleum, the tired faces of people waiting, always waiting. He wondered how many Arthur Hemlocks were tucked away in the labyrinthine corridors of places like this, their stories fading, their presence becoming a line item on a daily report. His hand instinctively went to the satchel, the outline of the wooden bird a familiar pressure. He had made a promise, long ago, a promise tied to that bird, and promises for Silas were not eroded by time or convenience. This hospital, with its efficient indifference, felt like the first of many quiet battles he might have to wage. He knew the system, the way individuals could get lost in the cogs of a large institution. He was not here to disrupt, not in the loud sense, but he was here to ensure that a life, a specific, valuable life, was not simply allowed to drift into the shadows unremarked and uncared for. The subtle freeze from the nurses at the mention of Arthur's name was not a deterrent. It was a confirmation. It told him he was in the right place, for the right reason, however unwelcome his presence might be. The weight of his purpose settled around him, a familiar cloak. Silas found a quiet corner in the designated waiting area, a space filled with the low murmur of hushed conversations and the rustle of newspapers. He didn't sit, preferring to stand near a window that looked out onto a patch of meticulously manicured but ultimately lifeless garden. He wasn't impatient. Waiting was something he understood. It was often a precursor to action, a time for observation. He watched Nurse Chloe as she moved behind the reception desk. She was younger than Martha, her movements less assured, her eyes holding a flicker of something he recognized, a nascent empathy, perhaps, or a discomfort with the status quo that she hadn't yet learned to suppress entirely. Once, when Martha was occupied with a phone call, Chloe's gaze briefly met his across the lobby. There was a question in it, a hesitant curiosity, before she quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. Silas made no sign, simply registered the fleeting connection. He knew that in large systems, it was often the individuals on the lower rungs, those not yet fully hardened by routine or ambition, who retained the clearest moral vision. He needed to find out more about Arthur's current situation, the specifics of his care, or lack thereof. Direct confrontation with Martha, he sensed, would be unproductive. She was a gatekeeper, wedded to protocol. He needed a softer approach, a way to glean information without raising alarms. The clock on the wall ticked with an indifferent slowness. 9:30, 9:45. At precisely 10, he moved back towards the reception. Martha was gone, perhaps on her rounds. Chloe was there alone, looking flustered as she tried to manage a persistent caller while simultaneously directing a lost-looking elderly couple. Silas waited patiently until she had a moment. "Excuse me, Nurse Chloe," he said, his voice still low. She looked up, startled, as if surprised he was still there or that he knew her name. "Mr. Hemlock, in Ward 7. Could you perhaps tell me his room number? And if there's a particular doctor overseeing his care?" Chloe hesitated, her eyes darting towards the empty space where Martha usually sat. He's in room 714, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "As for his doctor, Dr. Evans is the ward physician, but Dr. Finch, Alistair Finch, the department head, often consults." The way she said consults, with a slight, almost imperceptible pause, suggested more than the word itself. Silas nodded. "Dr. Finch, thank you." He saw her swallow, a nervousness in her throat. Is Mr. Hemlock a close relative?" she asked, then seemed to regret the question immediately, her eyes widening slightly, as if she'd overstepped. Silas offered a rare, faint smile. "He's more than that," he said. "He taught me the importance of looking closely, of seeing what others miss." He thought of Arthur, years ago, a man whose keen eyes and quiet wisdom had shaped him in ways he was only now fully appreciating. Arthur, who had once shown him a tiny, fledgling bird fallen from its nest, and patiently, meticulously, nursed it back to strength, teaching a young Silas about resilience and the profound value of every fragile life. The memory was vivid, connected intrinsically to the small wooden bird in his satchel, a bird he had carved under Arthur's tutelage. "He deserves to be seen," Silas added, more to himself than to her. Chloe looked down at her desk. "Ward 7 it's a busy ward, sir. Sometimes patients who don't have many visitors." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. But she had said enough. Silas understood. The forgotten ones. The ones who slipped through the cracks. "Thank you, Nurse Chloe," he said again. "You've been very helpful." He turned and walked towards the elevators, his steps deliberate. He now had a room number and the names of two doctors. One who was nominally in charge, and another whose influence, it seemed, cast a longer shadow. The path to Arthur was becoming clearer, but so too was the potential for obstruction. He felt the familiar weight of the past, not as a burden, but as a compass guiding his actions. Ward 7, East Wing, had a different atmosphere from the bustling lobby. Here, the air was heavier, tinged with the scent of antiseptic and something indefinably older, sadder. The corridors were long, the lighting dimmer, the sounds more muted, the beep of distant monitors, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes, the occasional hushed voice of a nurse. Silas moved with a quiet purpose, his eyes taking in the numbered doors, the charts clipped to their frames, the fleeting glimpses of patients within. Room 714 was near the end of a corridor, slightly isolated from the main hub of activity around the nurse's station. The door was ajar. He pushed it open gently. The room was small, sparsely furnished. A single bed, a nightstand, a utilitarian chair. And in the bed, a frail figure lay very still, turned towards the window, which offered a view of a brick wall. Silas stepped inside, his heart constricting. Arthur Hemlock, the man he remembered, had been vital, his eyes bright with intelligence and a quiet humor. The man in the bed was a pale shadow, his hair thin and white, his skin almost translucent. Yet, even in this diminished state, there was a familiar cast to his features, a ghost of the man Silas had known. He approached the bedside slowly. Arthur's breathing was shallow, regular. His eyes were closed, but his brow was furrowed, as if in a troubled dream. A tray with untouched food sat on the nightstand, a plastic cup of water beside it. There were no cards, no flowers, no personal belongings to suggest that this room was inhabited by a life cherished or remembered by others. Silas pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat. He didn't speak. He simply watched, his presence a quiet vigil. He reached into his satchel and took out the small wooden bird. He held it in his palm, its smooth, familiar contours a connection to the past, to the promise he had made. He remembered Arthur's workshop, the scent of cedar and pine, the careful, patient way Arthur had taught him to use the carving tools, to respect the grain of the wood, to find the form hidden within. Every piece of wood has a story, Silas, Arthur used to say, his voice gentle. Our job is to listen and to help it tell that story. Now, Arthur's own story seemed to be fading, unheard. Silas looked around the sterile room. There was an air of neglect, not necessarily of overt cruelty, but of a deeper, more insidious kind, the neglect of indifference, of being deemed unimportant. He noticed the call button near Arthur's hand, just out of easy reach. He gently repositioned it. He checked the water cup. It was tepid. He wondered when someone had last spoken to Arthur, not as a patient to be managed, but as a person. He sat there for a long time, the silence broken only by Arthur's soft breathing and the distant sounds of the hospital. He didn't try to rouse Arthur. For now, his presence was enough. He was bearing witness, a silent advocate in a room that felt forgotten. The wooden bird in his hand grew warm. It was more than a memento. It was a symbol of a debt, of a shared humanity that transcended age and illness. He recalled a day, decades ago, after Silas had lost his own father. Arthur had found him, adrift and lost, and had spoken not of sorrow, but of resilience. He'd pointed to a gnarled, old oak in the nearby woods, a tree that had weathered countless storms. Life bends us, Silas, Arthur had said. Sometimes it nearly breaks us, but the strong ones find a way to keep reaching for the light. Silas looked at the frail man in the bed. The light Arthur had once reached for seemed very dim now. It was Silas's turn to ensure it wasn't extinguished completely. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, a quiet anger at the casual way a life of such worth could be so easily marginal. The fight, he knew, would not be easy, but he was prepared. He had learned from Arthur, after all, the enduring power of patience and quiet persistence. An hour passed. Silas remained by Arthur's bedside, a still, watchful presence. The quiet of the room was eventually broken by the arrival of a nurse he hadn't seen before, an older woman with a brisk, no-nonsense air. She entered without knocking, her eyes on the chart in her hand. She registered Silas's presence with a brief, surprised glance, but said nothing to him. Her attention immediately focused on Arthur. She checked his vitals, made a note on the chart, her movements efficient but mechanical. "Mr. Hemlock," she said, her voice louder than necessary, as if speaking to someone deaf or slow-witted. "Time for your medication." Arthur didn't stir. The nurse sighed, a small, impatient sound, and proceeded to administer an injection. Silas watched, his expression unreadable. When she was done, she turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Are you planning on staying long?" she asked, her tone implying he was an inconvenience. "As long as necessary," Silas replied quietly. The nurse shrugged and left. The encounter, though brief, reinforced Silas's impression of a system that processed rather than cared. Shortly after, another figure appeared in the doorway, this one taller, dressed in a crisp white coat, a stethoscope draped around his. He had an air of self-importance, his features sharp, his gaze assessing. "Dr. Finch?" Silas inquired, rising slowly from his chair. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "I am, and you are." His tone was cool, professional, but with an underlying edge of authority. "Silas Thorne, a friend of Mr. Hemlock." Dr. Alistair Finch's eyes flickered towards Arthur, then back to Silas, a dismissive quality in his gaze. "A friend?" I wasn't aware Mr. Hemlock had many visitors. The implication was clear. Silas's presence was unexpected, perhaps even unwelcome. He hasn't been particularly responsive lately, Dr. Finch continued, stepping further into the room, though he made no move towards Arthur's bedside. His condition is, shall we say, static. We're managing his comfort, of course. Comfort, Silas repeated, the single word imbued with a quiet challenge. He looked pointedly at the untouched food tray, the call button he had repositioned. Dr. Finch's lips thinned. Mr. Thorne, this is a busy hospital. We have many patients with acute needs. Mr. Hemlock is receiving the standard level of care appropriate for his condition. The standard level, Silas echoed, his voice still low but carrying a weight that made Dr. Finch pause. And does that standard level include ensuring he has water he can reach? That someone speaks to him, not just at him. Dr. Finch straightened, his professional demeanor hardening into a mask of impatience. Are you questioning my staff's competence, Mr. Thorne? Or perhaps my own? I am questioning whether Arthur Hemlock, the man, is being seen, Silas stated, or merely processed as a diagnosis, a bed number. He gestured towards Arthur. This man taught me about the intrinsic value of every living thing. He deserves more than to be managed. Dr. Finch's expression turned cold. Mr. Hemlock is an elderly patient with multiple chronic conditions and limited prognosis. We provide palliative support. If you have specific concerns, you should address them through the proper channels, perhaps with the patient advocacy office. He glanced at his watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual medical emergencies to attend to. He turned to leave, clearly dismissing Silas and his concerns. Doctor, Silas said, his voice stopping Finch at the doorway. The doctor turned back, irritation etched on his face. Silas held up the small wooden bird, its form simple but resonant in the sterile room. Arthur taught me to carve this. He said it represented hope, endurance. Do you see any of that in your standard level of care for him? Dr. Finch stared at the bird for a moment, then at Silas, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or a fleeting, quickly suppressed discomfort. Sentimentality has little place in modern medicine, Mr. Thorne, he said icily. We deal in facts, in clinical realities. And with that, he was gone, leaving Silas alone once more with Arthur. The silence in the room now charged with the unspoken conflict. The battle lines had been drawn. Dr. Finch was not merely an antagonist. He was the embodiment of a system that prioritized efficiency over empathy, protocols over persons. Silas knew this would be a difficult fight, but the image of Arthur, so frail and forgotten, and the memory of the vibrant man he once was, strengthened his resolve. He would be Arthur's voice, his advocate. He would ensure Arthur was seen, truly seen. Silas spent the next few hours in quiet observation. He watched the comings and goings in the ward, the interactions between staff and patients. He noticed Nurse Chloe again, her movements often hesitant, her eyes frequently darting towards Arthur's room when she passed, a flicker of concern in her expression that she quickly masked if she caught anyone watching. He saw her gently adjust a pillow for an elderly woman in a nearby room, speaking to her softly, a stark contrast to the brisk efficiency of some of her colleagues. During a quiet moment, when the corridor was relatively empty, Silas stepped out of Arthur's room. He saw Chloe at the nurse's station, meticulously updating charts. He approached her slowly. "Nurse Chloe," he said, keeping his voice low. She looked up, a little startled. "Mr. Thorne, I spoke with Dr. Finch," Silas said. Chloe's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced around as if to ensure they weren't over her. "He seems to believe Mr. Hemlock is adequately cared for." Chloe bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the chart in front of her. "Dr. Finch is very focused on resources," she said carefully. "And Mr. Hemlock, he doesn't have family advocating, so sometimes—" She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Sometimes he's overlooked." Silas finished gently. Chloe nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "It's not that anyone means to be unkind," she whispered, "but there are so many patients, and he's so quiet. He never complains. Being quiet is not a reason to be ignored," Silas stated. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, worn leather-bound journal. It was Arthur's, a journal Silas had kept safe for him for many years after Arthur had moved into a care facility, long before this current hospitalization. "Arthur used to write in this," Silas said, opening it to a random page filled with Arthur's neat, precise handwriting and delicate sketches of birds and plants. He documented everything, observations about nature, thoughts on life. He was a man of great detail, great perception. He found a particular passage, one he had read many times. "Listen to this," he said softly. October 14th. Watched a spider spin its web in the morning dew. A miracle of engineering and persistence. So much strength in such delicate threads. It reminds me that even the smallest, most overlooked creations have their purpose, their beauty, their right to exist with dignity. He looked at Chloe. This is the man in that room, not just a collection of symptoms or a drain on resources. Chloe's eyes were shining. "He sounds wonderful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was," Silas affirmed. "He still is. You just need someone to remember that." He closed the journal. "Dr. Finch mentioned proper channels," Silas said. "Perhaps you could tell me who the head of patient advocacy is here? Or if there's a hospital administrator I should speak to about ensuring a patient's dignity is upheld." Chloe hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Mrs. Albright is the chief administrator," she said, her voice firmer now. "Her office is on the ground floor, near the main entrance. And Sarah Jenkins is the lead patient advocate." She scribbled the names and office numbers on a small piece of paper. "Thank you, Chloe," Silas said, taking the paper. "You have a good heart." She blushed slightly, but met his gaze. "Mr. Hemlock deserves better," she said quietly. "Everyone does." Silas nodded. He now had a direction. Dr. Finch might be a formidable obstacle, but he was not the only authority in the hospital. Silas would appeal to a higher sense of duty, of humanity. Armed with Arthur's journal, a tangible piece of the man's spirit, and the quiet support of a young nurse who dared to care, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for Arthur's dignity was far from over. Silas made his way to the ground floor, the administrative wing feeling even more detached from the raw humanity of the patient. Here, the corridors were carpeted, the lighting softer, the air filled with the quiet tap of keyboards and the hushed tones of professional conversations. He found Mrs. Albright's office, her nameplate gleaming on a polished wooden door. Her assistant, a woman with an impeccably professional demeanor, informed him that Mrs. Albright was in a meeting but could perhaps spare a few minutes later in the afternoon. Silas said he would wait. He found a seat in the small, tastefully decorated waiting area, Arthur's journal resting in his lap. He didn't read it. He simply held it, drawing strength from its connection to his friend. He thought about his impending conversation with Mrs. Albright. He wouldn't be aggressive, wouldn't make demands. He would simply present the truth, Arthur's truth, and appeal to her sense of responsibility, not just as an administrator, but as a human being. An hour later, the assistant beckoned him. Mrs. Albright's office was spacious, with a large window overlooking the hospital grounds. She was a woman in her late 50s, her attire sharp, her expression astute. She gestured for Silas to sit. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice polite but conveying a busy schedule. "My assistant says you have a concern regarding a patient. Mr. Hemlock?" "I do," Silas confirmed. "Arthur Hemlock is a very dear old friend. I am concerned that he is not receiving the level of attentive, dignified care that any patient, particularly one so vulnerable, deserves." Mrs. Albright steepled her fingers. "Dr. Finch is an excellent physician, Mr. Thorne, head of his department. I have full confidence in his clinical judgment and the care provided on his wards. I am not questioning Dr. Finch's medical knowledge, Mrs. Albright," Silas said calmly. "I am questioning the humanity of the care. Arthur is isolated, his basic comforts sometimes overlooked. He seems to be forgotten." He opened Arthur's journal, placing it gently on the corner of her large desk. This was Arthur's. He was a naturalist, a keen observer of life, a man of profound intellect and gentle spirit. He wrote about the dignity of all living things. Mrs. Albright glanced at the journal, but didn't touch it. "Mr. Thorne, hospitals are complex organizations. We have protocols, standards. We endeavor to provide the best possible care within the resources available. Dignity is not a resource, Mrs. Albright," Silas countered, his voice still quiet but firm. "It is a fundamental right. Arthur taught me that. He taught me that every life has a story worth hearing, worth honoring. Is his story being honored here? Or is he merely a bed to be managed until it is empty?" He then recounted his observations: the untouched food, the call button out of reach, the dismissive attitude of some staff, Dr. Finch's focus on clinical realities over human connection. He spoke of Arthur's past, his contributions, the quiet wisdom he possessed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He simply laid out the facts, colored by his deep, personal connection to Arthur. Mrs. Albright listened, her expression unreadable at first. She was a seasoned administrator, accustomed to complaints, to demands. But Silas's quiet conviction, his refusal to be intimidated or dismissed, seemed to penetrate her professional reserve. He wasn't an angry relative. He was a steadfast friend, advocating with a sorrowful dignity that was hard to ignore. "You mentioned Dr. Finch specifically," she said, her tone more measured now. "You feel he is unconcerned. I feel his priorities may lie more with systemic efficiency than with individual patient well-being, especially for those who cannot advocate for themselves," Silas stated. He then produced the small wooden bird from his satchel, placing it beside the journal. "Arthur helped me carve this when I was a boy. It's a knot-winger, a bird known for its resilience, for singing in the harshest conditions. Arthur believed in that resilience, in that enduring spirit. I believe it is our duty to nurture that spirit in him, not allow it to be extinguished by neglect or indifference." Mrs. Albright looked at the bird, then at the journal, then at Silas. For a long moment, she said nothing. The usual hum of the hospital seemed distant. "Mr. Thorne," she said finally, her voice softer than before, "thank you for bringing this to my attention, and for sharing Arthur's story. I will look into this personally. I will speak with Dr. Finch, and I will visit Mr. Hemlock myself." Silas met her gaze. He saw a flicker of something genuine there, a spark of the empathy he had hoped to find. "That is all I ask," he said, "for Arthur to be seen, for his dignity to be honored." He rose, leaving the journal and the bird on her desk. "Perhaps these will help you understand the man he is." The confrontation, if it could be called that, with Mrs. Albright had been draining, but Silas felt a sliver of hope. He returned to Ward 7, to Arthur's room. Nothing had visibly changed, yet Silas sensed a subtle shift in his own resolve. He had planted a seed. Now he had to wait and see if it would take root. He sat by Arthur's bedside, sometimes reading aloud from the journal, sometimes just holding Arthur's hand, its skin papery and cool. He spoke to Arthur, recounting old memories, shared jokes, the quiet wisdom Arthur had imparted to him over the years. He didn't know if Arthur could hear him, but it didn't matter. The act of speaking, of remembering, was for both of them. Later that afternoon, Nurse Chloe appeared at the door, a hesitant smile on her face. "Mr. Thorne?" Mrs. Albright was just on the ward. Silas looked up. "Oh, yes." She spent some time in Mr. Hemlock's room, and she had a rather long conversation with Dr. Finch in the hallway. Chloe's eyes sparkled with a hint of something. Hope, perhaps, or a touch of vindication. I don't know what was said, but Dr. Finch looked displeased. Silas allowed himself a small, internal smile. "Thank you for telling me, Chloe." Just then, Dr. Finch himself strode past the open doorway, his face a mask of thunder. He glanced into the room, his eyes meeting Silas's for a brief, charged moment. Then he continued down the corridor without a word. The air crackled with his unspoken fury. It was clear Mrs. Albright's intervention had not been taken lightly. Not long after, a different nurse, one Silas hadn't seen before, entered Arthur's room. She introduced herself as Nurse Davies, the new shift lead. Her demeanor was markedly different, warmer, more attentive. She checked Arthur's chart, then spoke to him gently, explaining what she was doing. She adjusted his pillows, offered him a sip of water, ensuring the call button was well within his reach. She even asked Silas if he needed anything. The change was subtle, but undeniable. Someone, somewhere, had given an instruction. Arthur Hemlock was no longer to be overlooked. Silas watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't sought a dramatic showdown, merely a recognition of Arthur's humanity. As Nurse Davies was leaving, she paused. "Mrs. Albright asked me to ensure Mr. Hemlock receives exemplary care," she said. "She also mentioned you, Mr. Thorne. She said you reminded her what this hospital is supposed to be about." Silas was taken aback. He hadn't expected such a direct acknowledgement. He simply nodded. Arthur deserves nothing less. The climax had not been a single, explosive moment, but a series of quiet pressures of steadfast advocacy, culminating in a shift within the system. The journal and the small wooden bird, resting on Mrs. Albright's desk, had spoken more eloquently than any raised voice could have. They had reminded a powerful administrator of the individual stories, the individual lives that were the true heart of the institution she managed. Arthur stirred slightly in his sleep, a soft sigh escaping his lips. For the first time since Silas had arrived, the deep furrows in his brow seemed to soften just a little. Perhaps, even in his unconscious state, he sensed the change, the return of a caring presence. Silas reached out and gently squeezed his friend's hand. The battle wasn't won, not entirely, but a significant line had been held, a small victory for dignity in a place where it was too easily forgotten. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Silas continued his vigil by Arthur's side, but the atmosphere in room 714, and indeed on the ward, had subtly transformed. Nurses were more attentive, their interactions with Arthur gentler, more personal. Fresh water appeared regularly. Meals were encouraged with soft words, and his room was kept brighter, cleaner. Nurse Chloe, whenever her duties allowed, would pop in, her initial nervousness replaced by a quiet confidence. She'd chat with Silas, share a smile, and sometimes even speak directly to Arthur, telling him about her day, a small, human connection that had been absent before. Dr. Finch remained a distant, somewhat glowering presence. He made his rounds, his assessments of Arthur now delivered with a clipped formality, but the dismissive edge was gone, replaced by a grudging professional. He never addressed Silas directly again, but Silas often felt the doctor's eyes on him, a silent acknowledgement of an unexpected adversary who had, against the odds, affected change. Mrs. Albright did not return to the ward while Silas was there, but her influence was palpable. She had sent Arthur's journal and the wooden bird back to Silas via Nurse Chloe, with a short, handwritten note. Mr. Thorne, it read, "Thank you for the loan of these precious items. They served as a powerful reminder. Mr. Hemlock will continue to receive the utmost care. Sincerely, Eleanor Albright." Silas kept the note with the journal. It was a testament to the fact that even entrenched systems could be moved by a single, principled voice. One afternoon, as Silas was reading aloud from Arthur's journal, a passage about the migration of monarch butterflies, their incredible journey guided by an unseen instinct, he noticed Arthur's eyelids flutter. He paused, his heart quickening. Arthur's eyes opened, slowly, a flicker of consciousness returning. They were clouded, unfocused at first. Then they seemed to fix on Silas. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Arthur's lips. "Silas," he whispered, his voice raspy, weak, but unmistakably his. Silas's own eyes welled. He leaned closer. "Arthur, I'm here." "Knew you would be," Arthur murmured, his gaze drifting to the small wooden bird Silas often kept on the nightstand. "My not-winger." "Yes, Arthur, your not-winger." Arthur's fingers twitched, and Silas gently placed the bird in his frail hand. Arthur's fingers closed around it, faint pressure. "Always believed," he whispered, his eyes closing again, but this time the furrows on his brow were gone. He seemed at peace. It wasn't a miraculous recovery. Silas knew that. Arthur was still a very ill man. But in that brief moment of lucidity, there had been recognition, connection, a shared understanding that transcended words. His spirit, though weakened, was still present, still resilient, like the not-winger he held. That moment was a profound vindication for Silas. It wasn't about winning a fight against Dr. Finch or the hospital system. It was about reaching his friend, about affirming Arthur's worth, his existence. He had kept his promise, not just the promise to be there, but the deeper promise to honor the values Arthur himself had embodied. The atmosphere of quiet care continued. Other patients on the ward, noticing the change in attention towards Mr. Hemlock, perhaps felt a ripple of hope themselves. Small acts of kindness, it seemed, could be contagious. Silas learned that Arthur, in his younger, healthier days, had volunteered at this very hospital, reading to sick children, tending the small, neglected garden. He had been a part of its fabric long before he became a patient, a detail lost in his records until Silas's inquiries prompted someone to look deeper. The quiet victory was bittersweet. Arthur's moments of lucidity became a little more frequent, though they were always brief. During one such moment, he looked at Silas, his eyes clearer than before. "The bird, Silas," he rasped. "It needs to fly, not be caged." Silas understood. Arthur wasn't speaking of the wooden carving, but of his own spirit, his own story. He was tired. He was ready. Silas simply nodded, his hand resting on Arthur's. "I know, my friend. I know." A few days later, Arthur Hemlock passed away peacefully in his sleep, the small wooden knot-winger still clutched in his hand. Silas was there, holding his other hand, the silence of the room profound, yet not empty. It was filled with the echoes of a long life, a cherished friendship, and a final, dignified peace. Nurse Chloe came in shortly after, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't say much, just stood beside Silas for a moment, a shared, silent grief. Even Dr. Finch, when he came to officially pronounce the death, seemed subdued. His usual brusque manner was softened by a respectful quiet. He looked at Silas, then at Arthur, a flicker of something unreadable, regret, perhaps, or a grudging respect in his eyes. He was comfortable at the end, Dr. Finch said, the words sounding almost like an apology. Silas nodded. Yes, he was. The hospital system moved on, as it always did. Beds were filled, charts updated, routines continued. But something had shifted, however subtly. The staff on Ward 7, particularly the younger nurses like Chloe, seemed to carry themselves with a new thoughtfulness. The story of Silas Thorne and Arthur Hemlock, of the quiet man who fought for his forgotten friend with a wooden bird and an old journal, became a hushed legend, a reminder of the human element that could so easily be lost. Silas made the arrangements for Arthur's simple funeral. It was a small gathering. Silas, Nurse Chloe, a few very elderly acquaintances from Arthur's distant past, and surprisingly, Mrs. Albright. She didn't speak, but her presence was a quiet acknowledgement. After the service, Mrs. Albright approached Silas. Mr. Thorne, she said, what you did, it's had an impact. We're implementing new training for staff, focusing more on patient advocacy and compassionate communication, especially for our most vulnerable patients. We're even dedicating a small, quiet garden space in Arthur's, the Hemlock Garden of Resilience. Silas was moved. Arthur would have liked that, he said. He believed in tending to small, forgotten things. He still had the wooden knot-winger. Arthur's hand had loosened its grip in the final moments, and Silas had taken it, now more precious than ever. It was no longer just a symbol of their friendship or of Arthur's spirit. It was a testament to the power of quiet advocacy, of steadfast integrity. It represented a promise kept, a dignity defended, a life honored. The small bird had, in its own way, taught an entire hospital something about its own heart. Silas Thorne walked away from the small cemetery, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet closure. Arthur was at rest, his memory honored, his final days imbued with the dignity he deserved. The battle had been quiet, fought not with anger or aggression, but with persistence, with truth, and with an unwavering belief in the inherent worth of his friend. The experience had reaffirmed Silas's own deeply held convictions, that one person, armed with integrity and a clear moral compass, could make a difference, even against seemingly entrenched systems. He thought of Nurse Chloe, her initial timidity giving way to a quiet courage. He thought of Mrs. Albright, an administrator who had been willing to listen, to be moved, to enact change. Even Dr. Finch, in his own way, had perhaps learned something, a grudging respect for the forces beyond clinical data. The hospital, City General, would continue its work, a complex machine of healing and sometimes of heartbreak. But perhaps, just perhaps, Arthur Hemlock's story and Silas's quiet intervention would leave a lasting imprint, a small, persistent reminder to see the person beyond the patient, the story beyond the symptoms. Silas reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, familiar shape of the wooden knot-winger. It felt warm, almost alive. It was a tangible link to Arthur, to the past, but also a symbol of a future where, with vigilance and compassion, such quiet battles for dignity might not always be necessary. He didn't know where his path would lead next, but he knew he would continue to live by the principles Arthur had taught him, to observe closely, to listen deeply, to value every life, and to speak truth, however quietly, in a world that often preferred not to. As he walked, a small, brown bird, a common sparrow, landed on a nearby branch, puffed up its chest, and sang a surprisingly robust song against the gray afternoon sky. Silas paused, a faint smile touching his lips. A knot-winger, perhaps in spirit. He continued on his way, the small wooden bird a comforting weight in his pocket, a silent promise to always remember, and to always, in his own quiet way, advocate for the song within every soul. The memory of the nurses freezing at the reception desk when he first mentioned Arthur's name now seemed like a distant echo. They, too, had been part of the journey, witnesses to a transformation, however small, within their own wall. And perhaps they, too, would carry a piece of that story forward.